Good evening. These are the main news headlines today. President Reagan is expected to announce tougher sanctions against Libya. Agriculture Secretary John Block has resigned. The U.S. denied claims of living American prisoners in Indochina. We'll have the details of these stories in a moment. Jim?
After the news summary, we look at why calls for sanctions against Libya fall on such deaf ears in Europe. There's part one of a new Charles Krause series on the U.S. military's important Latin command. An excerpt from Secretary Block's goodbye news conference, plus analysis of his reasons, and finally a report about an art dealer who does something else interesting on the side.
Funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T. Whether it's telephones, information systems, long-distance services, or computers, AT&T. Funding also is provided by this station and other public television stations, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
President Reagan is expected to announce new economic sanctions against Libya at a news conference this evening. A televised conference will be his first since last September. Officials say Mr. Reagan will take steps to bolster the economic sanctions in force against Libya for the past 4 years. No details emerged in advance as senior members of the administration gathered at the White House this morning to go over the plans. They included Secretary of State Shultz, Defense Secretary Weinberger, and CIA Director William Casey. Officials say the administration will soon issue a report to document its claim that Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, backs Palestinian and other terrorist groups outside its territory. U.S. sanctions already in place include a ban on imports of Libyan oil and the export of U.S. oil and military equipment. Diplomatic relations are severed and U.S. travel is restricted. Foreign ministers of 45 Muslim nations meeting in Morocco today declared themselves in firm solidarity with Libya. A resolution condemned what they called aggressive escalation on the part of international imperialism and the Zionist entity. Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres said he preferred sanctions to military action. The White House refused to discuss possible military action, saying it was better the Libyans be kept guessing. Jim?
There was an unconfirmed report today that Syria fired 2 anti-aircraft missiles at Israeli warplanes over Lebanon. A Beirut radio station said one missile exploded harmlessly over a village in the Bekaa Valley of eastern Lebanon. There was no word on the second missile. Israeli officials denied the reports. There was no immediate comment from Syria. And that completes our version of the news of this day. We go now to why the U.S. can't get the Europeans to move against Libya. Part one of Charles Krause's new series on the Latin command. Some press conference words on and analysis of Agriculture Secretary Block's resignation. And a report about an art dealer with a most unusual sideline.
Now that the Reagan administration has decided to stiffen economic sanctions against Libya, the question is whether they'll have any effect. Part of the answer to that will come from America's allies, who so far have been reluctant to join in any such action. That's our first focus section tonight, and we look first at the issue through European eyes. Andrew Hilton is the editor of International Reports, a New York-based financial advisory service published by the Financial Times of London. Mr. Hilton, why have Europeans balked at sanctions so far?
I think there are 2 reasons, one philosophical and one practical. The philosophical one is that in the Europeans' view, sanctions very, very seldom work. They can squeeze the population, they can make life more unpleasant, but at least in the short term, they tend to reinforce support for the ruling group. In the second place...
Give us an example of where they've tried them and have not worked recently.
Well, I think obviously the key example there is Rhodesia. It took 15 years of sanctions against Ian Smith to bring about any material change in the form of government in Rhodesia. Indeed, in the early years of sanctions, the Rhodesian economy was actually strengthened. It diversified, it found ways to get round the sanctions, and the political support of Smith really was strengthened in the early years of the sanctions. It was not until very, very close to the end, very close to the establishment of Zimbabwe, that the sanctions really started to have a material impact. 15 years is too long.
No, the practical side.
The practical point is that the Europeans are much, much more dependent on trade than is the US. In the US, trade is equivalent to approximately 15% of GDP. In the European countries, it's 40 to 50%, and most Europeans perceive sanctions as cutting off their nose to spite their face. Moreover, they tend to say that there's nothing that we provide to the Libyans, or indeed to any other country, that other countries cannot provide as well.
We being in this case?
We being in this case the Western Europeans.
The Western Europeans. Let's go through the leading Western European countries who, if they join sanctions, might be presumed to not only please Washington but have an effect, and go individually over a few of them why they might not. Which do you think is the most important of them in Libya's case?
I think the most important far and away is Italy. Libya was for many years an Italian colony, and the links, both economic and political, between Rome and Tripoli are really very substantial.
What is Italy's stake in Libya?
It has about 25% of Libya's total trade. Eni, which is the state oil company, is very heavily involved in Libyan oil exploration, and there are many Italian contractors building roads, building dams, building, in fact, the great man-made river scheme that Gaddafi is doing. The involvement of the Italians is pervasive in the Libyan economy, and indeed it's reciprocal. The Libyans, as you're probably aware, have 14% of fiat. They also own a very large amount of real estate in Rome, and the links between the two countries are very great.
So that even though Italy, through Rome Airport, was one of the ones hurt by this recent terrorist attack, there is going to be at least a strong disinclination to break down that considerable trade.
A very strong disinclination. As one remembers from the MacNeil-Lehrer affair, there is very little constituency in Rome, indeed in Italy, for anything which appears to be perceived of as Arab bashing.
What about West Germany?
West Germany is the second of the Western European countries in terms of its economic stake. It has about 16% of total Libyan trade, but indeed most of that is simply oil imports. West Germany gets... Libya is actually the third largest supplier of West German oil, and that's really the limit of the West German stake. There is some shipment of pharmaceuticals, of machine goods, but it's not really... West German exports to Libya are nothing like as important as West German imports from Libya.
And France?
France is an interesting case because France and Libya were at the beginning of 1985 virtually on the verge of war over the Chad affair.
Chad being the former French colony which lies right to the south of Libya, and which Gaddafi invaded. Right,
and they fought to a diplomatic standoff, and it's not clear which way the French will turn on this. France is gearing up now for parliamentary elections, and the government is extremely fragile. There is indeed strong differences between the president and the prime minister at the present time, and no one really knows, I think, which way the French are going to jump on this. But they are not as dependent either on Libyan oil or indeed on work in Libya for their construction companies. Nevertheless, a great deal of Libyan oil is moved into Europe through Marseille, and I think that that's an important benefit that the French will be very loath to give up.
And Britain?
Well, Britain, as you're aware, a couple of years ago, a policewoman, Yvonne Fletcher, was shot by a Libyan diplomat in London. The initial reaction of Mrs. Thatcher was very harsh words, but the Libyans then, in retaliation for what they perceived to be the unnecessary expulsion of the diplomatic corps, seized a number of British businessmen and held them until the British essentially capitulated. So the British have a track record of tough words on Libya, but really very, very little in the way of action.
But Mrs. Thatcher also has a record of cooperating with Ronald Reagan on many foreign policy issues.
Indeed. I think this is where her philosophical bent is actually split two ways, because on the one hand she is strongly opposed to economic sanctions and has made that very clear in this particular case. On the other hand, she is, of course, Mr. Reagan's principal supporter in Europe. But so far she has been adamant that the British will not go along with economic sanctions.
Okay, we'll come back. Jim?
Some input now from Henry Schuler, an old hand on Libya and sanctions against it. He served there as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, and then for 2 American oil companies. He was an advisor to the Reagan administration on the sanctions imposed against Libya in 1981. He is now with the Georgetown University Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. Mr. Schuler, what do you think of Europe's reasons for not going along with sanctions?
Well, Jim, we've got to recognize that it's not going to be quick and it's not going to be easy to get European support for sanctions. Clearly, there is an inertia, there is a reluctance to enter into sanctions on Gaddafi because of commercial interests. But those commercial interests are not really that strong. It was pointed out that Libya is the 3rd largest supplier of Germany's oil. but that amounts to only 9% of Germany's oil imports in the most recent quarter for which we have oil import statistics. Only 2% of France's oil imports. Those are relatively small amounts. The total amount of oil exported to Europe in the second quarter of 1985, the latest statistics, was 851,000 barrels a day.
That's from Libya.
From Libya.
Mm-hmm.
There are...
Now put 850,000 barrels in some context for me.
That is 13% of total OECD Europe oil imports. Compares to...
So if it was cut off tomorrow, Europe would still function very, very well, you think?
There is 8 to 10 million barrels a day of unutilized oil production capacity available in the Middle East, and a large chunk of it in Nigeria, which produces comparable quality crude oil. It would be inconvenient for the Europeans to replace Libyan supplies, but it certainly would have no impact on the economy.
What about Italy specifically? You heard what Mr. Hilton said, 25% of Libya's trade is with Italy, all of the ties, both historic and otherwise. What do you think of that?
Let me say something about those historic ties. Gaddafi came to power really as an anti-colonial basher and was very harsh on the Italians. He went to the extent of digging up the bodies of Italian colonists who had been buried in Libya and shipping them back to Italy. That's not the basis of a long historic relationship with Gaddafi. Gaddafi's planes have attacked Italian ships. So it's been an off-again, on-again thing with the Italians as well. Right now, to be sure, the Italians have very strong economic links with Libya. But I dare say that those economic links pale by comparison to the economic links that Italy and the rest of the European nations have with the United States. So that if the United States were to provide some reminders of the importance of the U.S.-European economic relationships, we might put a little different perspective.
You think that's what it's going to take? The U.S. is going to have to get tough?
I think the U.S. has to provide an unequivocal example of what sanctions policy can be, and then unflinching leadership to try and bring the allies into support.
Now, does unflinching leadership mean go to Italy and say, all right, you want to trade with Libya? Well, maybe we will restrict or reduce some of the trade the United States has with Italy? You think the United States should go that far?
I think it should be done in a sophisticated, not an across-the-board basis, but such things as saying to the Italians, if you want to sell military hardware to the Libyans, then the next time the U.S. Army is out for telecommunications equipment or whatever vote we have in NATO, we may be unfavorably disposed towards the purchase of Libyan or of Italian military hardware. Similarly, with respect to oil.
And similarly with respect to West Germany, France, and all the others?
If the threat of terrorism, and if Gaddafi's support for terrorism is seen as great a threat as it is by this administration, and if that threat is seen as great enough to justify military intervention, then it seems to me clearly proper to go to the allies and say, this is the alternative, is military intervention. If you are not prepared to support us on economic sanctions, there is no other avenue left to us.
Thank you. Robin?
Mr. Hilton, is the kind of pressure Mr. Schuller is talking about likely to be influential in Europe?
Well, it obviously depends how much the Americans are prepared to press. Clearly, you can make the Europeans do what you want them to, but at a price. And I think that Libya is not really an issue as far as the Americans are concerned, which is worth pushing the Europeans to the wall for.
Mr. Schuller?
Robin, I think this administration thinks it is an issue. It's gone on for 16 years as the United States followed essentially the European policy of doing nothing about Gaddafi, and the situation has only gotten worse. This administration, if it's prepared to countenance military activities, then it ought to be prepared to lean on the allies.
Mm-hmm. How do you react to that?
I think it's going to take an awful lot of pressure on the American part to get the Europeans to go along. One reason is that the Europeans see this as a very important precedent. They don't like the idea of sanctions at all. They especially don't like the idea of American-imposed sanctions. They look at the Soviet Union, they look at the gas pipeline, they look at the Cockham restrictions on East-West trade, and they say, well, if we give in on Libya now, then Eastern Europe could be closed off to us.
That was quite a big issue a few years ago between the Reagan administration and NATO allies, wasn't it, Mr. Schuller? The trying to get the European allies not to take part in the big Soviet gas pipeline, and it caused severe strains within NATO, and eventually the Reagan administration backed down on it. Is this a serious enough issue to risk causing those kinds of strains within the NATO alliance again?
I submit that it's a very different situation in this instance. That was the Soviet Union, which is obviously a much more important market to Western Europe than Libya is. It was a situation that was much more gray than the issue of support for terrorism and getting involved in the massacres in European countries.
Well, on that point of being gray, one of the countries directly affected in the December 27th attacks, Austria, its airport in Vienna was attacked. Its foreign minister said today there was no solid evidence linking. He said his country might consider sanctions, but he said at the moment there's no solid evidence linking Libya with that December 27th attack. What do you think about that?
Well, as far as the evidence is concerned, whether the administration has it and is prepared to release it, I can't answer. But it's entirely clear that Gaddafi has supported financially and by providing haven the terrorists, both Abu Nidal and other terrorists. So he creates the atmosphere in which these terrorists can operate. And if we hold ourselves to a standard of proof that would be required in an American court of law, we're never going to be able to do anything, and these actions are going to be able to continue.
The State Department said, or officials said today, that the U.S. is going to publish a white paper or something comparable on this. If there were kind of evidence that Mr. Schuller is talking about, would that change the minds of the governments? We're talking about the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Austrians.
Well, I think it's hard to conceive of the smoking gun that would really convince the Europeans to go along. The white paper is going to be fairly iffy. The Europeans have come to an accommodation with Gaddafi. They see him more as a rogue than as an out-and-out villain. The perception of Libya in Europe is very, very different to the perception of Libya in this country. It's not the arch-villain, it's not the arch-financial backer of every revolutionary movement in the world. And there is a feeling there that the Americans are overreacting.
Mr. Schuller?
The United States, as the leader of the free world, has responsibilities that European nations do not have. They can afford to reach an accommodation with rogue regimes and make these fine-line distinctions. The leader of the free world cannot, unless we are prepared to accept a continued terrorism and disruption of the peace process. Gaddafi's role clearly is unimportant, except as a spoiler. But that spoiler can make sure that there is no peace, no compromise settlement reached in the Middle East. And as long as that is the case, we will have uncertain political situation and all the risks that go with that, and unstable governments throughout the area.
Is there, Mr. Hilton, in Europe, not only a different perception of Gaddafi, but a different perception of the Middle East issue itself, the central Middle East issue itself, which is behind this reluctance to move with the United States?
I think that's obvious. I think it's very true. The Europeans see sometimes, and this is very sad that one has to say it, but they see the Americans as doing the Israelis' dirty work. And I think that this is one issue on which a lot of Europeans would rather that the Americans stayed out.
You got a very brief comment, Mr. Schuller?
Well, in response,
Americans doing Israel's dirty work?
I don't think that we are doing anybody's bidding in that regard. We're looking after our own interests, and that's certainly what I would like to see us do.
All right, thank you both very much. Jim?